Españoles, Franco ha muerto.
Spaniards, Franco is dead. Those were the sombre, tearful words that announced the death of Spanish dictator Francisco Franco 50 years ago. Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. I'm Lorcan Doherty, and today we're looking back at the Franco regime and what life in Catalonia was like during the dictatorship. We'll also explore the excitement of the transition to democracy that followed Franco's death and the rise of the far right again today, especially among young people. Coming up, we'll be hearing from renowned historian Andrew Dowling and distinguished Catalan photographer Pilar Aymerich. So stay tuned for those interviews. I'm joined today by Cillian Shields. Hello, Cillian.
Lorcan, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Don't forget, if you're listening to us, you can also watch us. This is our third video episode of Filling the Sink. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and of course, catalannews.com. Cillian, before we dive in, I just thought we'd be good to point out, especially to younger members of our audience, that 50 years ago is not ancient history. And 50 years ago, Spain, a country in Western Europe, was living under a dictatorship.
It's true, yeah. It feels like such a faraway thing at the moment. It feels like something that you're only reading the history books and doesn't feel real. But to so many people who are alive today, still taking part in politics and society, they lived through this. I mean, Franco died November 20th, 1975, 50 years ago this month. That's why we're talking about it on this episode of the podcast to kind of mark that anniversary. And of course, it's really important to remember that Franco died in his bed. Franco died peacefully. His regime was never overthrown. He was never kicked out. He never faced any trial or any justice. Although the Democratic Memory Law in 2022 did deem his regime illegal. So we've got these kind of small steps towards some semblance of justice. But ever since his death, really, Spain has been grappling with the legacy of the dictatorship, as well with the ebullient transition to democracy and the Pact of Forgetting.
Yeah, the Pact of Forgetting, we're going to be talking about that later on as well. But if we take a step back, more than 50 years ago, in fact, 4 decades earlier, Franco, to give us everyone a bit of context, he was one of the military leaders of this 1936 coup against a democratically elected Second Republic in Spain. The coup didn't take full control immediately, and that sparked the brutal 3-year Spanish Civil War, which claimed hundreds of thousands of lives.
Yes, exactly. Even in an interview very early on in the war, he mentioned that he wanted to conquer Spain inch by inch. Now, this was a deliberate tactic to go slowly. Why? In order to rid Spain of Marxism, as he put it in his own words. He wanted to do this at whatever cost. He was asked for clarification in an interview what that meant, if it meant shooting half of all Spaniards. And he replied, I repeat, at whatever cost.
Franco's nationalist forces won the war in April 1939, and he immediately took full control of Spain. The violence didn't stop with the end of the war. Opposition was banned. Thousands of Republicans and just perceived enemies were imprisoned, executed, or driven into exile, especially here in Catalonia, so close to the French border. And so Spain entered nearly 40 years of a dictatorship characterised by murder, violent repression, and control. One very prominent example for Catalonia is Luis Companys. He was the president of Catalonia during the Civil War, who was arrested by the Nazis in occupied France in 1940, so after the war. He was handed over to the Franco regime and executed. The only democratically elected head of government in Europe who was executed in the 20th century.
Yeah, you mentioned the Nazis there. It's a thing that really needs to be pointed out also that the Nazis, Mussolini's Italy, very much helped Franco during the war. They participated in the bombing both of Catalonia, Barcelona especially, and the northern cities as well. It's where the Condor Legion, the infamous Condor Legion during World War II kind of trained, basically practiced for the war, most famously in Guernica, which was immortalized into this breathtaking painting by Pablo Picasso. There's an acute line from historian and Franco biographer Paul Preston. He said before in a documentary, Franco makes an investment in terror, and he lives off the profits of that for a very long time. Now, he's speaking about that period known as the White Terror. this period of violence which came after the war as a means of kind of controlling the population. Mass murder of perceived enemies, like we mentioned. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people were killed during this period. And of course, nearly 500,000 retreated over the border of Catalonia into France during this time to avoid such fates.
One thing it's important to point out, though, Cillian, I think, is that historians generally divide the dictatorship into two halves. The first half, kind of what we've been talking about, mostly defined by brute force. And then the second half by trying out new economic policies and opened up Spain to the rest of the world, kind of during the Cold War period we're talking about here. So the regime, as they would put it, first delivering peace, in inverted commas, and then delivering prosperity, also perhaps in inverted commas.
Yes, that's exactly right. And we wanted to take a deep dive really into a more specific topic related to the repression that was felt in Catalonia during the course of the 36-year-long dictatorship. Because obviously over such a long period of time, society changes, the people who are alive change. And obviously the means of controlling such a huge amount of people must also change with that. For example, I always heard that the Catalan language was banned during the dictatorship, but obviously people still speak it today. It has survived. So I wanted to find out a little bit more. How was the repression actually felt? How did it evolve over nearly 4 decades?
Okay, well, Andrew Dowling has worked on Catalan history since the 1990s, and he's reader in contemporary Spanish history at Cardiff University.
And we started a conversation on the idea that it's impossible or perhaps even useless to think of the Franco regime as one monolithic and uniform thing, how it evolved greatly over the course of 36 years and was influenced by many different people during different periods.
By the middle of the 1960s, for example, you could go to bookshops in Barcelona and you could find works of Catalan literature, you could find newly published works as well of poetry and non-fiction. And you could also buy, in fact, works published by Karl Marx and Marxist publications, etc. Now, when I say that, it does not mean that it wasn't still a police and military dictatorship, but the basis of the Franco regime evolved and transformed and changed. And its social basis really is formed on the repression of the losing side in the Spanish Civil War, the defeated, essentially. But by the late 1950s, one of the big things that happens in the evolution of the Franco regime is that its economic policies have essentially been disastrous. So as late as sort of the middle of the 1950s, Spain has still not recovered the economic position it held in 1936. By the 1960s, it begins to kind of rebrand itself as being based around essentially delivering prosperity to ordinary Spaniards, which is very different to what it was delivering in terms of harsh and brutal violence in the early 1940s.
Tell me a little bit about what kind of repression we saw in Catalonia during the dictatorship.
I think it's essential that we also understand that the Spanish Civil War, as fought out in Catalonia, was also very complex. It was also a kind of civil war within Catalan society, because some elements in Catalan society, including like traditional regionalist forces and sectors of the church and etc., supported the Franco regime as a kind where, from their point of view, where the alternative was predominantly anarchist revolution. So you get a deep and profound fracturing of Catalan society during the Spanish Civil War. Now, the Franco regime is restored, and it kind of restores, if you want, bourgeois authority, traditional authority. It restores the traditional power of the Catholic Church. And many conservative sectors within Catalan society kind of sigh a huge sigh of relief that Francoism has kind of destroyed the danger, from their point of view, of the radical social revolution. But the price, of course, that's paid is that they have to kind of deny their own Catalan identities. From 1939 until the mid to the late 1940s, the Franco regime embarks on a program of the systematic destruction and public destruction of Catalan language, culture and identity. So this can be, whether it's kind of like simple changing of street names, changing names of all sorts of organisations, the absolute prohibition of the usage of the Catalan language in any public space whatsoever. So it's simply kind of like it is not given any public rights, and essentially a mass kind of regime of propaganda saying that Spanish is the language, speak Spanish, that is the language that must be spoken.
There were comparatively fewer executions after the Civil War in Catalonia compared to other parts of Spain, and Andrew Dowling points out that geography played a key role in this fact.
The fact that Catalonia borders France made a very important difference, that a number of very important people, and we're talking like thousands and thousands of individuals, were able to escape across the Pyrenees and be held in camps across the border. So that meant, in comparative terms, that the actual violent repression in terms of the number of executions is lower in Catalonia compared to other regions of Spain. It's very much the highest in Extremadura and Andalusia, etc. But we do know that at least around 4,000 people are executed.
I'm fascinated by this idea of the regime loosening its grip on the repression of Catalan culture and identity. Can you tell me, why did it? What were the elements at play? Why did the regime decide to loosen its grip and start to allow some elements of the Catalan language and identity?
As the regime becomes more secure in itself into the 1950s and beyond, they gradually are able to obtain ever more opportunities, concessions, to the point that by the early 1960s, of course, you have the Catalan monthly magazine, Serra d'Or, which becomes, a widespread, widely read, widely circulated magazine published completely in the Catalan language. By the 1950s, and this is absolutely to do with the internal security of the regime, in the sense that it now felt secure. It established kind of international agreements with the United States of America, American bases. It was able to join the United Nations. It shifts very gradually, where it permits what we can call folklore. So there's a kind of like a reappraisal, a reframing to say that, the sardana is a dance that can be valued for its folkloric value. Okay, so it's kind of like it's depoliticized, and it simply said this is a very safe dance. It also has a strong kind of like Catholic cultural heritage behind it. But again, we shouldn't want to exaggerate too much that comparative tolerance. There's absolutely no space for the Catalan language in any meaningful public sense.
Looking forward then just a little bit after this kind of process, with a focus on the transition to democracy. I mean, just before it, we saw a monumental gathering, I suppose, in Catalonia, one that is still spoken of with a huge degree of reverence today, the Assembly of Catalonia. Can you tell us what happened there? Who were the players involved, and what objectives were there for this grand meeting?
The Assembly of Catalonia is overwhelmingly dominated by the Catalan communists, but it meets in the monastery of Montserrat. Two different cultures that were on opposite sides in the Spanish Civil War. Communists and Catholics would have been simply inconceivable as kind of acting in some way together. And it's not only involves communists, it involves all of the major Catalan political organisations, civic organisations, trade unions, etc. And it establishes a very simple platform, which it calls freedom, liberty, freedom. It wants to see political prisoners released. It wants to see the restoration of a Catalan statute of autonomy, which is abolished by the Franco regime. One of the most important things that will develop amongst the broad Catalan opposition to Franco is an incredible, strong sense of political unity. Political unity happens across Catalan society much earlier than the rest of Spain. So it's happening in the late 1960s. So Catalan society develops in a very important way to achieve a kind of like social, cultural and political unity.
Andrew Dowling, our thanks to him. Those final years of the dictatorship that Andrew talked about, of course, lasted right up until Franco's death. What followed was a very interesting, turbulent and exciting period. The transition, it's known as here.
Yes, the transition to democracy, as it is called. Franco's chosen successor, Juan Carlos, was appointed king and head of state of Spain. Now, Franco hoped that he would continue the ideology, continue Francoism, but instead Juan Carlos pushed for a constitutional monarchy.
Okay, so we're talking about democracy, a massive regime change from what went on before.
Yes, absolutely. But if you think about it, this can't just happen. You can't just install new political institutions, regimes. It had to be done legally. So there were huge challenges to legally bringing about this regime change. Effectively, the Cortes, essentially the parliament during Francoism, it existed. It had to effectively vote for its own dissolution, which they did thanks to some very canny political manoeuvring. Basically, they were promised nice pensions and a comfortable life in their older age, because their other choice was trying to go against the tide of the country, continuing Francoism, and potentially face huge legal consequences.
Yeah, and end up on the wrong side of history as well. Juan Carlos forced Franco's last prime minister then to stand down.
Yes, exactly. This was Carlos Arias Navarro. It should be pointed that Juan Carlos actually kept him in place to begin with. He was chosen to continue in the role by Juan Carlos with the idea of overseeing this transition. But eventually his idea of reforms didn't turn out to be that reformative. So eventually, the king dismissed him and brought in a second prime minister, Adolfo Suarez. Now, he was a lot more forward-thinking. He actually led the Union of the Democratic Centre political party, which won the 1977 general elections in Spain. So he became Spain's first democratically elected prime minister since the Second Republic.
Okay, so this democratically elected parliament, then one of their first big tasks was to draft a new Spanish constitution.
Yes, exactly. Ultimately, there were 7 men chosen from across the political spectrum. It included 2 Catalans, 2 out of 7. There was Miquel Roca Junyent from the Democratic Convergence of Catalonia, and also Jordi Solé Tura, at the time of the Communist Party of Spain, and later of the PSOE, the Socialist Party of Spain and Catalonia.
Well, 7 men were appointed, but that's what was happening politically speaking in the late 70s here. Meanwhile, on the streets, in music and art and fashion, there was a whole cultural revolution taking shape.
Totally, yeah, an absolute explosion of joy, of freedom, of rights. And photographer Pilar Aymerich from Barcelona was one person who not only lived through this time, but actively documented it as well. I had the pleasure of catching up with her ahead of the opening of a new exhibition featuring some of her work during the transition in the Fujifilm House of Photography in Barcelona.
I always thought that I was living in an important time. I mean, the transition from Francoism to democratic freedoms was very important for me, and I believed it was history happening live.
Aymerich felt an air of optimism arrive after the death of Franco and during the period of shifting to a democracy.
I think the people of Barcelona, Catalonia, and all of Spain were excited to recover some rights that they did not have. There was this big mix of joy because you knew that things were turning a corner, that it was irreversible, that democracy would come with all of its problems and inconveniences. There was some uncertainty, but young people, like I was at the time, experienced it with a lot of joy because you were thinking about a future world.
As a photographer, Pilar Aymerich looked for details and stories in the people that she saw on the street.
Above all, demonstrations of identity, the first Catalan National Day of 1976, the return of former exiled president Josep Tarradellas, all these historical moments. I kept up with the whole feminist movement too, which at that time didn't have any role models because feminism didn't exist before then. I think that Barcelona started to love itself too. They started cleaning the facades of the Eixample, which were all black, the love for the city, which in more tragic moments completely disappeared.
She noticed details of the dictatorship and the transition to democracy, even in how people dressed.
When I came back from London in the mid-1960s, I was one of the first to wear a miniskirt here. When I returned, I remember going to a fabric store to buy some fringes to put on all my skirts, because otherwise people would say things to me on the street because they could see my legs. Then in the transition, silly small things changed, like you could take off your fringes and show your legs. This was a joy and a new way of living.
The first thing that Pilar Aymerich did when she heard that Franco died?
I bought a bottle of cava, like I think everyone in Spain did. And then with the cava at home, I said, now I'm going out into the street. But the first day people were scared too, because they didn't know what would happen next. We didn't know what the future would be. A lot of things were being said, that there could be a military coup again. There was hope that it would be better, but also uncertainty.
She says that the dictatorship was characterized by fear, but that the transition to democracy saw that fear erode.
The demonstrations were so big because people were no longer afraid to go out onto the street. I knew that the police could come, they could beat you, that they could take you to jail, but there wasn't the same fear like there was before. There was an air of freedom that I think swept everyone up.
Pilar Aymerich assures that the transition to democracy was hugely important for women and feminism as well.
The first thing it meant was a change of laws. That was the main thing. The right to divorce, which didn't exist before, the right to abortion. When I came back from France, still during the dictatorship, I wanted to open a bank account for the small photography business I had, and they told me that I had to go either with my husband or with my father because I couldn't open a checking account on my own.
No podia obrir un compte corrent.
Our thanks to Pilar. Pilar clearly remembers that, Cillian, as a very exciting period, but in this negotiated transition to democracy, we also had what's called the Pact of Forgetting, which included an amnesty.
Yes, this was effectively a sort of a political and a social agreement to leave the past behind, to effectively ignore the political legacy of the dictatorship. And this was all underpinned by that amnesty law, which was passed in 1977. Now, this amnesty law freed political prisoners, it allowed exiles to return, but it also gave impunity to those who committed crimes during the dictatorship and the Civil War. Now, the legacy of this is extremely nuanced. Now, you could argue that in the short to medium term, this was actually successful because it ensured a pretty smooth transition to the liberal democracy that exists today. But it's clearly had some unintended consequences in the more longer term. It's denied those who suffered torture, who suffered crimes against humanity, who suffered atrocities, any kind of closure. And it's also still hampering many judicial cases today.
In recent years, there have been some efforts to bring to justice some of the cases of torture committed by the regime's police, particularly in the police station in Via Laietana in central Barcelona. Have a listen to this.
Jo el que vull, jo I tots els que hem lluitat, no?
What I want, myself and everyone who has fought, we want these people to go down in history for what they did. It's no longer just about us. There are a few of us left, but it's for all the people who they killed, who they tortured, for those who had to live in exile, whose lives were destroyed. For all these people, we want them to go down in history for what they did.
I per tota aquesta gent volem que passin a la història per el que van fer.
That was Maribel Ferrandiz, a left-wing activist tortured in 1971.
Yeah, now hers is one of 3 legal cases related to torture in that police station that's being blocked by the 1977 amnesty law. Ferrandiz believes that in addition to bringing to account those responsible for her torture, she believes that Spanish democracy and justice should also explain history properly, especially to the younger generations.
Yeah, her case, along with that of Carlos Vallejo, who we heard from in episode 4 of Filling the Sink, actually.
5 years ago.
5 years ago. Those cases haven't been able to get off the ground in the Spanish courts, who see the cases as a non-starter because of the amnesty law. Instead, lawyers are trying to push in the UN and in the European Court of Human Rights to seek justice through those means.
A third case, more recently, which is pretty interesting, saw a torture victim be given the chance to testify before a judge for the very first time. That only happened in May of this year, 2025. This was Blanca Serra, and her case dates back to torture in both Barcelona and Madrid between 1977 and 1982. That's after Franco died, important to point out, but obviously the regime kind of still had a lot of presence in the various institutions, the police, of course. This case is still being investigated by a newly created Public Prosecutor's Office for Democratic Memory, which now must decide whether to take it to court to continue investigating it.
Another one of the echoes of the past that still resonates today is the issue of unmarked mass graves.
In Catalonia,
In Catalonia, since 2017, we have a mass graves plan that is very systematic and still ongoing. Every day of the year, we're working to find and to recover the people who were buried without dignity in unmarked graves.
Francesc Xavier Menendez, the Director General for Democratic Memory here in Catalonia.
Now, since the start of the century, the Catalan government has documented around 1,000 mass graves all across the territory dating back to the Spanish Civil War and the early years of the Franco dictatorship. Now, 1,000. But despite that, only 137 have actually been excavated so far. This has largely been thanks to the Mass Grave Plan, which was only launched in 2017. So far, around 1,000 bodies have been recovered from these sites. but only 34 out of 1,000 have been fully identified using DNA. More than 8,000 people have been registered as missing by their families.
In the interview Menendez did with the Catalan news agency, our colleagues, he acknowledges that progress has been slower than originally hoped. Excavations began far too late, but nevertheless, the priority now is to fully identify all the bodies that can be identified and to give those that remain anonymous a dignified burial.
I think it's also important to point out as well that bodies decay over time. If people want to get this dignity, this right to a decent burial, there is a time limit on when this can happen. And if they want to happen, it kind of has to be done pretty soon.
Cillian, I think it would be remiss to look back on the death of Franco without mentioning the rise of the far right again today. We've seen Vox become the third biggest party in Spain, and polls just this week have Aliança Catalana, the Catalan Alliance, vying with Carles Puigdemont's party Junts for third place in Catalonia.
Yes, and I think it's particularly noteworthy as well that young people are becoming more and more right-wing in general. Now, we have a few numbers here to kind of illustrate this point, which always works great in a podcast format, but bear with us, please. So according to long-term surveys that have been carried out by the Catalan Youth Agency, asking people aged 18 to 29, young people, to place themselves on the ideological spectrum, with 0 being extreme left and 10 being extreme right. In 2024, the average value exceeded 4 for the very first time. It shifted from 3.4 in 2019 to 4.3 in 2024.
It sounds like a small shift, but it's a real indication of the direction of travel at the minute.
Absolutely. And on top of that, the average population above the age of 29 gave a score of 4.1. So that means for the first time this century at least, young people are more right-wing than their parents.
Another thing they noticed was that the shift to the right is more pronounced in young men than it is in young women. And, you know, looking into this, reading what various experts are putting it down to, one is the general disillusionment and pessimism with the current state of politics.
Yeah, I think that's a trend that we're kind of seeing all across the world, really. Approval rates for governments are kind of historically low in almost every country that you look at. There's also been this sort of nostalgia for authoritarianism and a very important digital shift as well. Ideas are being shared at a much faster rate online, on social media, on TikTok, than they've ever been shared before. And part of this is also a phenomenon that's known as anemoia. Anemoia is a trait that young people are exhibiting more and more. It's a longing for an idealized but artificial past that they never lived, as basically a refuge from the current uncertainty that we're all living through at the moment.
Yeah, and as part of that, we're seeing an attack on progress that's been made, for example, in Spain over the last 50 years. You know, all the social polarization that we see today, it creates opportunities for far-right voices that want to dismantle all the social and cultural progress that has been achieved through the decades. I'm talking about advances in feminism and maybe particularly in Catalonia and Spain in democratic memory as well. Vox have said that the 2022 democratic memory law that you mentioned, well, if they were ever in power, they would get rid of that, you know. Which
they could easily be in power pretty soon, the way things are going. But we won't speculate on that too much.
Which means all those cases we talked about, no hope of seeing any justice. Those mass graves that we talk about, they'll be left.
Yeah. About the attack on progress that you mentioned there, I think it's also interesting to point out that there's been a huge kind of muddying of the argument of many of the left or the perceived left from the right. So a very common phrase that I've heard in recent years is, I'm not neither machista nor feminista, as though these were sort of diametrically opposed things, as if they're opposites necessarily. But yeah, it's just kind of this attack on progress, this kind of imagining that feminism is also an extreme equivalent to machismo, which it's not, it's a different thing.
Yeah, and we've got lots of material related to marking 50 years since Franco's death on our website, catalannews.com, and on our social media, of course, as well. You can find videos, for example, of our interviews with Andrew Dowling and Pilar Aymerich. That's us for today. Thanks for listening and watching. Thanks again to Pilar Aymerich and to Andrew Dowling, and thanks to you, Cillian.
And thanks to you, Lorcan.
Remember, you can subscribe to Filling the Sink wherever you get your podcasts. We'll have another episode for you next month. Until then, from me, Lorcan Doherty, and all of us here at Catalan News, bye for now. Adeu.